The year was 202 BC, and on a dusty plain in North Africa, two of history's greatest military minds prepared to clash in what would become the most decisive battle of the ancient world. Here, beneath the scorching African sun, Rome's rising star would face Carthage's legendary lion in a confrontation that would reshape the Mediterranean forever. This was not just another battle. This was the culmination of 17 years of brutal warfare, a final showdown between two civilizations that could no longer coexist. On one side stood Hannibal Barca, the man who had terrorized Rome for over a decade, whose very name sent shivers through the streets of the Eternal City. On the other, a young Roman general who had dared to take the war to Africa itself, forcing the great Hannibal to abandon his Italian campaign and return home to defend Carthage. What followed at Zama would not only end Hannibal's legendary career, but would establish Rome as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. To understand how this epic confrontation came to pass, we must journey back to the darkest hour in Roman history. By 216 BC, Hannibal had already humiliated Rome at the Trebia River and Lake Trasimene, but it was at Cannae where he delivered his masterstroke. There, through tactical genius that would be studied for centuries, Hannibal encircled and annihilated the largest army Rome had ever fielded. 8 legions, nearly 70,000 Romans, lay dead on that blood-soaked field. The road to Rome itself lay open, and panic gripped the city as survivors stumbled through its gates with tales of unimaginable slaughter. Yet from this catastrophe emerged an unlikely hero. Among the few who escaped Cannae was a young military tribune named Publius Cornelius Scipio. While other survivors spoke of deserting Rome entirely, this 20-year-old patrician drew his sword and forced them to swear an oath of loyalty to the Republic. It was a moment that revealed the character of the man who would one day bring Hannibal to his knees. But that day seemed impossibly distant. For 14 years, Hannibal ravaged Italy like a plague. His army, a polyglot force of Africans, Spanish warriors, and Gallic barbarians, moved through the peninsula like ghosts, striking where least expected and vanishing before Roman reinforcements could arrive. Cities fell or submitted. Allies defected to Carthage. The very foundations of Roman power seemed to crumble with each passing season. Rome's response was cautious to the point of paralysis. The dictator Fabius Maximus, later dubbed the Delayer, refused to face Hannibal in open battle. Instead, he shadowed the Carthaginian army, harassing its supply lines and avoiding decisive engagement. This strategy, though wise, frustrated the Roman people who demanded action. They watched helplessly as their countryside burned and their prestige evaporated. While Rome struggled to contain Hannibal in Italy, the war's true turning point was taking shape in distant Spain. The Iberian Peninsula had become Carthage's treasure house, its silver mines funding the war effort and its fierce tribes providing fresh recruits for Hannibal's armies. Control of Spain was vital to both sides, and it was here that young Scipio would first demonstrate the genius that would eventually triumph at Zama. The appointment of Scipio to command in Spain was unprecedented. At just 25 years old, he had never held the consulship or praetorship, yet the Roman Senate granted him proconsular authority over one of the war's most crucial theaters. This decision raised eyebrows among Rome's conservative elite, but desperation breeds innovation, and Rome desperately needed fresh leadership. What Scipio accomplished in Spain defied all expectations. His first target was New Carthage, the heavily fortified capital of Carthaginian Spain and the hub of their entire operation in the region. The city seemed impregnable, protected by strong walls, a loyal garrison, and its position on a peninsula surrounded by the sea. Previous Roman attempts to capture it had failed miserably. But Scipio was no ordinary commander. He had studied his enemy carefully, learning not just their tactics but their psychology. He understood that warfare was as much about winning hearts and minds as it was about winning battles. Where other Roman generals had treated Spanish tribes as conquered subjects, Scipio courted them as potential allies. The siege of New Carthage in 209 BC showcased Scipio's innovative approach to warfare. While his army assaulted the city's landward defenses, he had noticed something his predecessors had missed. At low tide, the lagoon on the city's northern side became shallow enough for men to wade across. Local fishermen had told him of this phenomenon, attributing it to the favor of Neptune himself. Whether divine intervention or careful observation of tidal patterns, Scipio exploited this weakness with devastating effect. As the main assault drew the defenders' attention to the southern walls, a picked force of soldiers waded through the shallows and scaled the undefended northern fortifications. Caught between two attacks, the garrison crumbled. New Carthage fell in a single day, yielding vast stores of gold and silver, weapons and supplies, and most importantly, Spanish hostages held by the Carthaginians to ensure tribal loyalty. Here Scipio revealed another facet of his genius. Rather than treating these hostages as prisoners of war, he freed them without ransom and sent them home laden with gifts. This act of calculated magnanimity sent shockwaves through Spanish society. Tribe after tribe began to question their allegiance to Carthage, drawn by this Roman general who fought with honor and treated enemies with respect. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Spanish auxiliaries began deserting Carthaginian armies in droves. Local chieftains who had fought for Carthage for generations suddenly found themselves reconsidering their loyalties. Scipio had achieved something no Roman commander had managed before. He had turned Spain's population against their Carthaginian overlords, not through force, but through diplomacy backed by strength. The Carthaginian response was swift and predictable. 3 separate armies converged on Scipio's position, commanded by the most experienced generals Carthage possessed. Hannibal Barca, Hannibal's own brother, led one force. Hasdrubal Gisco commanded another. Mago, the youngest of the Barca brothers, brought up the third. Together, they fielded over 70,000 men, nearly double Scipio's numbers. Any conventional commander would have sought defensive positions and hoped to survive the onslaught. But Scipio was far from conventional. He saw opportunity where others saw only danger. The 3 Carthaginian armies were operating separately, unable to coordinate effectively across the vast Spanish landscape. If he moved quickly and struck decisively, he could defeat them piecemeal before they could unite their strength. The campaign that followed demonstrated Scipio's mastery of maneuver warfare. Like a skilled chess player, he positioned his forces to threaten multiple objectives simultaneously, forcing his enemies to react to his moves rather than implementing their own strategy. When the Carthaginian armies finally converged near the town of Ilipa in 206 BC, Scipio was ready for them. The Battle of Ilipa would become Scipio's tactical masterpiece, a brilliant demonstration of psychological warfare combined with innovative battle formations. For several days, the 2 armies faced each other across the plain, each morning deploying in identical formations. Scipio placed his Roman legions in the center, with Spanish allies on the flanks, while the Carthaginians mirrored this deployment with their African veterans in the center and Spanish troops on the wings. This daily ritual lulled the Carthaginians into complacency. They began to expect the same routine, the same formations, the same cautious maneuvering that had characterized the previous encounters. But Scipio was studying his enemies, learning their patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to spring his trap. That moment came at dawn on a day when the Spanish mist hung low over the battlefield. Scipio had prepared his men in darkness, briefing them on a radical new battle plan that would reverse everything the Carthaginians expected. When his light cavalry and skirmishers struck the enemy camp at first light, the Carthaginians rushed to form their usual battle line, still groggy from sleep and caught off guard by the unexpected assault. But when the mist cleared and the armies stood revealed, the Carthaginian commanders received a shock that would echo through military history. Scipio had completely reversed his formation, placing his veteran Roman legions on the flanks while positioning his Spanish allies in the center. It was a mirror image of Hannibal's own tactics at Cannae, but employed with devastating effectiveness against Carthage itself. The psychological impact on the Carthaginian army was immediate and catastrophic. Their carefully planned deployment, designed to counter Scipio's expected formation, was suddenly useless. Worse, they found themselves facing the very tactics that had made Hannibal famous, turned against them by a Roman who had learned from their greatest victories. The Battle of Ilipa unfolded like a deadly dance choreographed by a master tactician, as the Carthaginian wings found themselves facing Rome's most experienced legionaries instead of the expected Spanish auxiliaries, confusion rippled through their ranks. The African veterans in the center, Carthage's finest soldiers, suddenly realized they were isolated, facing Spanish troops whose loyalty to Carthage had already been shaken by Scipio's earlier diplomacy. Scipio's genius lay not just in the reversal of his formation, but in the timing of his attack. As his Roman legions on the flanks began their advance, they moved at an oblique angle, striking the Carthaginian wings, while the center remained stationary. This created a crushing pincer movement that the enemy simply could not counter. The Spanish troops fighting for Carthage, already demoralized by their countrymen's defection to Rome, began to waver under the relentless pressure. The collapse came suddenly and completely. The Carthaginian wings crumbled under the assault of Rome's finest soldiers, while the center found itself surrounded and cut off from retreat. Thousands of Carthaginian soldiers lay dead on the field, while their commanders fled in disorder. Hannibal Barca managed to escape with a fraction of his army, but Carthaginian power in Spain was broken forever. News of Ilipa's victory sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean world. In Rome, crowds gathered in the Forum to hear reports of their young general's triumph. The boy who had survived Cannae had not only survived but had turned Hannibal's own tactics against his homeland. In Carthage, the defeat meant the loss of Spain's wealth and manpower, resources that had sustained their war effort for nearly 2 decades, but Scipio was far from finished. The victory at Ilipa had given him more than just military success. It had demonstrated that Carthaginian armies could be defeated, that their generals were not invincible, and most importantly, that their allies could be turned against them. The young Roman had learned perhaps the most crucial lesson of warfare. Victory belonged not just to the strongest or the most numerous, but to those who could adapt, innovate, and turn their enemies' strengths into weaknesses. As Carthaginian resistance in Spain collapsed, Scipio faced a choice that would define the rest of the war. He could consolidate his gains, secure Spain for Rome, and wait for reinforcements. Or he could take an audacious gamble that would either end the war quickly or result in catastrophic defeat. The young general chose audacity. In 204 BC, Scipio launched his invasion of North Africa itself. It was a move so bold that it left even his supporters breathless. While Hannibal still roamed Italy with a dangerous army, Scipio proposed to attack Carthage's heartland directly. The Roman Senate was divided. Conservative voices argued that it was madness to divide Rome's forces while Hannibal remained undefeated, but others saw the genius in Scipio's strategy. By threatening Carthage itself, he would force them to recall Hannibal from Italy, finally ending the nightmare that had plagued Rome for over a decade. The invasion force that crossed to Africa was relatively small, perhaps 30,000 men, but it was composed of Rome's most experienced soldiers. Veterans of the Spanish campaigns, they had learned to fight in Scipio's innovative style, adapting to new situations and exploiting enemy weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. More importantly, they believed in their commander absolutely, having seen him work miracles against impossible odds. Landing near the ancient city of Utica, Scipio immediately set about implementing the same strategy that had worked so brilliantly in Spain. Rather than simply conquering territory, he sought to win allies and turn Carthage's own subjects against their masters. The key to this strategy lay in the complex web of alliances that dominated North African politics. The most crucial of these potential allies was Massinissa, king of the eastern Numidians. For years, Massinissa had fought alongside Carthage, his swift cavalry providing crucial support for their armies. But political intrigue and personal ambition had gradually soured his relationship with Carthaginian leadership. When Scipio's envoys reached his court with offers of alliance, they found a receptive audience. The defection of Massinissa was a catastrophe for Carthage that went far beyond the loss of his warriors. The Numidian cavalry had been the backbone of Carthaginian military power for generations. Swift, skilled, and perfectly adapted to North African warfare, they had given Carthage a decisive advantage in countless battles. Now they would fight for Rome instead. Carthage's response was desperate, but predictable. Unable to match Rome's growing strength in Africa with their remaining forces, they sent urgent messages to Italy. Hannibal must return. The greatest general in Carthaginian history must abandon his long campaign and come home to defend the motherland. For Hannibal, The order must have felt like a knife to the heart. After 16 years of campaigning, after bringing Rome to its knees, he was being recalled just when victory seemed within reach. But Hannibal was nothing if not a loyal son of Carthage. In 203 BC, he began the painful process of evacuation. The army that had terrorized Italy for so long boarded ships at Croton, leaving behind the peninsula they had dominated for nearly 2 decades. Veterans who had fought at Cannae and Trebia, soldiers who knew every hill and valley of central Italy, found themselves sailing toward an uncertain future in Africa. The army that Hannibal brought back to Africa was formidable but flawed. His core of veterans, the men who had followed him across the Alps and through countless battles, remained among the finest soldiers in the world. But they were aging now, worn down by years of campaigning, and their numbers had been steadily depleted by death and desertion. To fill out his ranks, Hannibal was forced to recruit hastily trained local troops and unreliable mercenaries. Even more concerning was the question of cavalry. In Italy, Hannibal had relied heavily on Gallic horsemen and allied tribes for his mounted forces. But these troops could not be transported to Africa, and with Massinissa's defection, Carthage's traditional source of cavalry had dried up. The army that would face Scipio at Zama would be dangerously weak in the very arm that had given Hannibal so many of his greatest victories. There was one weapon, however, that Carthage still possessed in abundance. In their African heartland, they maintained herds of war elephants, massive beasts trained for battle and capable of spreading terror through enemy ranks. Hannibal assembled a force of 80 elephants for his final campaign, hoping that these living battering rams could break Roman formations as they had broken so many others. But these elephants were not the seasoned veterans that had crossed the Alps years earlier. Most were recently captured and hastily trained, lacking the discipline and battlefield experience that made war elephants truly effective. Worse still, Scipio had faced elephants before in his African campaigns and had developed specific tactics to counter them. As the two armies maneuvered toward their final confrontation, both commanders understood that this battle would decide everything. For Hannibal, defeat meant the end of his career and the destruction of Carthaginian power. For Scipio, victory would crown him as Rome's greatest general and secure his place in history. The stage was set for a clash between two military geniuses, each representing a different vision of how wars should be fought. The armies finally converged near the town of Zama, roughly 100 kilometers southwest of Carthage. Here, on a dusty plain beneath the African sun, the fate of the Mediterranean world would be decided in a single day of brutal combat. The morning of October 19th, 202 BC dawned clear and hot over the plains of Zama. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield, two armies began their final preparations for what both commanders knew would be the decisive engagement of the Second Punic War. The air itself seemed to thrum with tension as tens of thousands of warriors made ready for combat, sharpening spears, adjusting armor, and stealing glances at the enemy formations taking shape across the field. Hannibal deployed his forces in 3 distinct lines, a formation that revealed both his tactical genius and his desperate circumstances. In the front rank stood his least reliable troops, a motley collection of Gallic and Ligurian mercenaries mixed with hastily recruited Moors and other African auxiliaries. These men were expendable, meant to absorb the initial Roman assault and blunt its momentum before the real fighting began. Behind them waited Hannibal's second line, composed of Carthaginian citizens and Libyan troops, better trained and equipped than the mercenaries, but still not the cream of his army. It was in the third line that Hannibal placed his hopes for victory. Here stood the veterans of his Italian campaigns, the grizzled survivors of Cannae and Trebia, who had followed him across the Alps 16 years earlier. These men were the finest soldiers Carthage possessed, their loyalty absolute, their skill honed by decades of warfare. If anyone could break the Roman advance, it would be these battle-hardened warriors who had made Rome tremble for so long. But it was the sight of Hannibal's front line that truly captured the imagination of friend and foe alike. 80 war elephants stood in formation before the Carthaginian army, their massive forms swaying gently as they awaited the signal to charge. Draped in colorful cloth and armor, with howdahs carrying archers and spearmen, they presented a spectacle both magnificent and terrifying. To the untrained eye, they seemed like living fortresses, unstoppable engines of destruction that would scatter any force foolish enough to stand against them. Yet Scipio gazed upon this fearsome array with calculating eyes rather than fear. His years in Africa had taught him much about war elephants, and he had developed specific tactics to neutralize their threat. More importantly, he could see what others might miss. These elephants lacked the discipline of truly veteran war beasts. Many showed signs of recent capture and hasty training, their handlers struggling to maintain control even before the battle began. The Roman deployment that morning was a masterpiece of tactical innovation. Scipio had arranged his legions not in the traditional tight formation that had served Rome for centuries, but in a revolutionary new pattern designed specifically to counter Hannibal's expected tactics. The hastati, Rome's youngest soldiers, formed the first line as usual, but instead of presenting a solid wall of shields and spears, Scipio had left deliberate gaps between his maniples. These gaps were filled with velites, Rome's light infantry, armed with javelins and trained in skirmishing tactics. But their true purpose was far more sophisticated than mere screening. When the moment came, these lightly equipped soldiers could quickly withdraw through the passages, allowing the elephants to charge harmlessly through the Roman formation rather than smashing into it. It was a tactic that required perfect timing and iron discipline, but Scipio's men had trained extensively for this moment. Behind the hastati stood the princeps, veteran soldiers in their prime, who formed the backbone of Rome's military might. These men had fought in Spain under Scipio's command, had learned his innovative tactics through years of brutal campaigning, and trusted their general absolutely. They would serve as the anvil upon which Carthaginian attacks would be broken. In the rear, the triarii waited with their long spears, Rome's ultimate reserve and final line of defense. On the Roman wings, Scipio deployed his cavalry with characteristic cunning. On the left flank, 2,500 Italian horsemen prepared to face their Carthaginian counterparts. These were solid, reliable troops, but they were not the key to Scipio's battle plan. That honor belonged to the right wing, where 4,000 Numidian cavalry under Massinissa's personal command pawed the ground in eager anticipation. The sight of Massinissa's horsemen must have been particularly galling to Hannibal. These were the same swift riders who had given Carthage so many victories over the years, their hit-and-run tactics perfectly suited to African warfare. Now they would fight for Rome, their intimate knowledge of Carthaginian methods turned against their former masters. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any sword thrust. As the armies completed their deployments, a strange ritual began that would become one of history's most famous encounters. Hannibal, perhaps sensing that this might be his final battle, requested a personal meeting with Scipio. The two greatest generals of their age would speak face to face before their armies clashed in mortal combat. The meeting took place in the no-man's land between the two forces, with both commanders accompanied by small retinues of their most trusted officers. Here, beneath the blazing African sun, the architect of Rome's greatest defeats faced the young general who had turned the tide of war. Contemporary accounts suggest that both men recognized the other's genius, speaking with the mutual respect that only true masters of warfare could share. Hannibal, now in his mid-40s and showing the wear of decades of constant campaigning, reportedly offered terms for peace. Carthage would abandon all claims to territory outside Africa, pay substantial reparations, and acknowledge Roman supremacy in the Mediterranean. It was a generous offer from a position of weakness, the plea of a man who perhaps sensed that the tide of history had turned against him. But Scipio, confident in his tactical preparations and the quality of his troops, rejected the proposal. The time for negotiation had passed. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many Romans had died for anything less than complete victory to satisfy the Republic's honor. The two generals parted with courteous words, but both knew that only one would leave the field victorious. As they returned to their respective armies, the final preparations for battle began in earnest. Priests moved among the Roman ranks, offering prayers to Mars and Jupiter, seeking divine favor for the coming engagement. Standards were blessed, weapons consecrated, and omens read in the flight of birds overhead. The soldiers themselves went through their pre-battle rituals, checking equipment one final time and sharing what might be their last words with comrades who had become closer than brothers. In the Carthaginian ranks, a different sort of preparation was taking place. The elephant handlers whispered soothing words to their massive charges, feeding them specially prepared mixtures designed to increase their aggression when the time came to charge. The mercenaries in the front line fingered their weapons nervously, knowing they were expected to die so that better men might live. Behind them, the veterans of Italy shared memories of past victories, reminding themselves of what they had accomplished when the odds seemed just as hopeless. The sun climbed higher, its heat beginning to shimmer off the dusty plain as the final moments before battle ticked away. Both armies were deployed, both commanders had made their plans, and the fate of the Mediterranean world hung in the balance. This would not be merely another battle in the long catalogue of ancient warfare. This would be the collision of two military philosophies, two ways of understanding combat, and two visions of how the civilized world should be ordered. The elephants began to trumpet their battle cries, a sound that carried across the plain like thunder. War horns answered from the Roman lines, their brazen voices adding to the growing cacophony. Thousands of men raised their voices in battle songs and war chants, the sound building to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. And then, in a moment that would echo through the ages, Hannibal raised his arm and gave the signal. The Battle of Zama had begun. The dust settled over Zama, and with it fell the curtain on one of history's greatest military careers. Hannibal's elephants lay scattered across the field, his veterans slaughtered, his dreams of Carthaginian supremacy buried beneath the African sand. Scipio Africanus had not merely won a battle. He had orchestrated the complete destruction of an empire's ambitions, turning Carthage's own weapons and tactics against them with devastating precision. The young Roman who had survived Cannae as a terrified tribune now stood as master of the Mediterranean world. His innovations in warfare, from the gaps in his formation to his mastery of psychological combat, had proven that even the greatest military minds could be defeated by those willing to learn, adapt, and evolve. Rome's victory at Zama was more than conquest. It was the triumph of systematic preparation over individual brilliance, of institutional resilience over personal genius. Hannibal would live on in exile, his legend intact but his power forever broken. Scipio would return to Rome as its greatest hero, having achieved what no general before him had managed. He had not just defeated Hannibal, he had ended the age of Carthage and ushered in the era of Roman dominance that would last for centuries. The Elephant War was over. Rome's empire had begun.